Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the inaugural seminar of the Carleton University Disability Research Group series, Access, Inclusion, and Disability, Connecting Scholars and Practitioners. I'm Ryan Patterson with the CUDRG and the Carleton Accessibility Institute. I'm a white man, glasses, brown parted hair, short brown beard, no mustache, white shirt, sweater vest, jacket. We are also joined by my series co-organizers, Professor Dominic Marshall and Natalie Amato, and a wonderful international audience. While the seminar itself is virtual, we acknowledge that Carleton University campus is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And we are fortunate to have two stellar scholar practitioners with us today to explore exciting new fields of accessibility for museums and art galleries. Ahlam Bavi, PhD candidate in interdisciplinary graduate studies, digital art and humanities at the University of British Columbia, and Patricia Bérubé, PhD candidate in cultural mediations at Carleton University, mediations, apologies, the letters. PhD candidate, Culture Mediations, Carleton University, Patricia Bérubé. Please note that we have muted all of you until the discussion portion at the end of the seminar, halfway through, and that this event is being recorded. So as I pass to Ahlam, being muted, please join me visually in welcoming both our speakers.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Patterson. So I think this I should share my screen. Okay. Is everything clear? Yes. Okay, hello everyone. As Dr. Patterson mentions, my name is Ahlam Bavi, but you can call me Ahlam. And I'm in my fourth and final year in the Digital Art and Humanities in Interdisciplinary Studies. Graduate Studies, IGS at the University of British Columbia. Today, I'm going to talk about a part of my PhD research that I'm using 3D technologies to make cultural heritage more accessible for blind and partially sighted and general public with the focus on gamification. I always just start my presentation with the fact that this is a fact that by 2050, the number of people with blindness in the global population is predicted to increase to 61 million. Moderate and severe vision impairment is predicted to affect 474 million people and mild vision impairment to affect 360 million. These facts obviously shows the number of blind and partially sighted people are increased and their need to have access to devices, environments, and information that are not accessible for them might be a big issue for the future of these huge communities. So, why using 3D technologies? I use 3D technologies because the application of them are broad in different fields, even in cultural heritage. For example, using 3D technologies in heritage could be applicable for conservation, restoration, and repatriation of cultural heritage. In this case, returning some things back to a community where the original were found could be one of the main repatriations goals of using 3D modeling of tangible cultural heritage. In the art field, using 3D technologies could give various degrees of freedom to explore ideas and render them into new realities. Later in my presentation, I will show you some of my artworks that are designing and using 3D modeling and 3D printing. Sorry. So in this slide, you can see some practical examples of applying 3D technologies in art field that I previously worked on it back in 2018. I was interested in the differences of languages, and I did some experiments on how to make sound signals in 3D models and show the differences of the languages visually. From left to right, you can see the workflow that how a 2D visual signal became a 3D printed replica. And in the right side of your screen, you can see the six different replicas that each represent a same phrase in different languages. The result of these collections became a tactile art exhibition in Alberta as an accessible exhibition for blind and partially sighted who could touch the sculptures. This was even accessible for general public to come and touch the sculptures. In this slide, you can see the result of 3D digital sculpting, experimenting several 3D printers, methods, and materials, and became so that's the result became some sonic sculptures. In the right side, you can see a line of poem by Daphne Marlette, printed by SLA printer at UBC, which is this is one piece of a big collection that that will be an exhibition and will be curated by UBC in the coming year. So now see some sample of using digitization and 3D technologies for tangible cultural heritage and the important question of digitization as colonial and decolonial practices. First picture from left, you can see the original Nefertiti bust in Neues Museum, Berlin, Germany. And the other are several digital iterations of these sculptures in different platforms. Art critics argue that digital scans and prints of cultural heritage for public use is a form of cultural colonialism. Therefore, one of the challenges of using 3D technologies and digitization of cultural heritage, even though for accessibility purpose, is the colonial sense of digitization. Because of the digitization, reproduction of cultural heritage can call into question the authenticity of objects, intellectual property, and reinforce colonial practices, which is a concern for marginalized communities in the context of Western society that have a history of extractive practices and cultural appropriation. On the other hand, the Art Institution of Chicago and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, they just created platforms for visitors to easily scan their museum's objects and publish them for the public. It is interesting to know that in 2019, two German artists published the digital data of a scanned bust of Nefertiti, the one that you can see, and releasing it into public domain. This undercover release was called an ethical heist because Germany had refused to repatriate the bust, the original bust, to the Egyptian museum, and also named this sculpture as a German national treasure. So in my research, I try to deal with the challenge of digitization using different theoretical lenses to find the most appropriate solutions to this dilemma and using some kind of like non-colonial approaches for digitization. I argue that gamification within an ethical framework can shift scholarly attentions to creating new form of digital heritage for improving the engagements and experience of blind and partially sighted visitors from historically excluded communities. Specifically, we examine 3D printed models as tactile, playful, and gameful remediation, a concept that refers to the use of game elements and game design game design technique in non-game context, and develop strategies based on inclusive design principles for use in scenarios where heritage items cannot be taught. Now let's talk more about gamification more specifically. As I previously mentioned, gamification, which refer to the use of game elements and game design techniques, such as user feedbacks and additive level of progress in non-game context, has been used to improve heritage pedagogy and accessibility for and engage with museum and art galleries visitors. In my research, using scaled 3D printed models, I show that gamification can play an essential role in providing blind and partially sighted visitors in museum and art galleries an incentive to engage with the digital and physical archive, guiding them in experiential learning and enabling new insight into heritage. Therefore, implementation of 3D models as gamified objects can improve viewership, sharing, learning, and open discussion on redress for historically excluded groups when it comes to their heritage. Gamification of digital heritage can enable a more diverse group of visitors to fully participate in the museum and art galleries experience. So I think this table is not clear, but so sorry for that. But with this in mind, we all know that making a new product, even a game, requires a design plan. Which start with a list of elements and materials that one is working with the fundamentals. Researchers in the gaming industry, however, do not always agree on what the game design elements are or what they should be called. Within these debates, we developed a framework titled Gamification Matrix, GMX. So later, after presentation, I try to show the better quality of these matrix and table. So this is a GMX matrix to establish the most common game strategies, tactics, and game styles as the starting point for any game designers, even in the cultural heritage designers that using cultural heritage. GMX is a framework that helps game designer identifying the most conducive game architecture to ensure its effect as both an interactive learning and entertaining experience. The framework is arranged based on the resemblances and relation of the game elements and is shown with alphabetic tags. Just keep in mind that in the game theory, resemblances and relations are mostly used to distinguish game classifications. So I just always use this as a starting point for my design. From now on, you can see some pilot projects designed to explore my hypothesis. So, but just like before to start, remember that the game and play have ontological differences as play is open-ended and without scorekeeping. Whereas game, on the other hand, generally optimize rules and tactic towards some rewards. Therefore, in these pilot projects that I'm going to show you, I use both play and game as my approaches in design. This slide specifically is a recreation of some ancient cultural heritage objects from Mesopotamia and Persia. Just briefly give you an introduction that ancient stamp and cylinder seals are valuable archaeological objects that give chronological and geographical information. Also, they give us information about the trade from the businesses, daily life, historical and social life, and religious practices. When the physical stamp and the cylinder have not existed, the pattern on the clay that are mostly made by pressing stamp on or rolling the cylinder on the clay could give us information about the actual cylinder or stamp. The image in the left side of your screen, you can see that this is the remaining texture of the stamp. And in the middle, you can see the workflow of the recreation of one of that single textures that it's in 2D. And the last one, you can see in the left, it's a 3D printed, it's a 3D model of this stamp. Also, you can see that we use kind of GMX. I use the GMX approach, GMX actually table as my method. So you can see that on the right side, this is the implementation game canvas for this replica that shows the tactic and strategies to play with these replicas in the cultural institutions. This is another project that I try to recreate some of the cylinders based on their existing pattern using Metropolitan Online API collection. So the actual cylinder and seal from the previous slide, they are not existent. So we just work on the evidence of the textures. So we believe that a package of 3D replicas designed based on the remaining texture of the ancient cylinder and stamps could help museum visitors to have a real experience of how previously pieces of clay tablets could be made. Therefore, visitors, able-bodied or disabled or special needs, can press replicas of stamp or cylinder across damp clay to create an impression of the engraved design. So in this slide, you can see the experience that the visitors had in the museum with the replicas, the 3D printed replica that I previously talked about. This is another example. In this example, you can see how I designed a board game, puzzle collections, and tactile replicas based on the Spain caves that are well known for some of the most ancient examples of prehistoric cave paintings and pictographs. The animal painted on the ceiling are at least 14,000 years old, and it is clear that some of these paintings even cannot be accessible for public to see them. In this case, we should ask, could blind and partially sighted access these paintings? So it was my main question for this design. So I just started to make 3D replicas from the sketches of the cave paintings and present them as a 3D printed braille coded collections that could be used as a game settings for general public to benefit from them in educational institutions. More importantly, these are accessible for blind and partially sighted. Based on the previous projects. So this shows the workflow of making a puzzle from cave paintings. From left to right, you can see it's the actual painting. The second one is a tactile diagram that blind and partially sighted can touch it. And the third one is a 3D model. And the last one is a 3D printed puzzle that is braille coded too. And everyone, even more mostly blind and partially sighted, can benefit from these gamified objects. So we found that digitization and replication of cultural heritage could be used to reveal some hidden part of history. For example, as an hypothesis, to find out how cave humans draw the gigantic images in the cave, we use Flasher to make a huge shadow of small-scaled replicas that could be the same process that cave humans draw the sketches, but instead of a Flasher, they may just use torch. So I'm cautious about time, and hopefully this is my last slide. So this is another example of design that we remediated of paintings from Franz Klein, who is an American painter. And part of the goal of these projects was to evaluate the sustainability of accessible 3D printing technologies and the quality of the model using them in various platforms. In this example, you can see that I use different printers and different materials, FDM printer and SLA printer. And also, we try to work on the quality of the model, the 3D model, that we wanted to use it in the VR environments. So I have a very short video to using. I'm not sure that we have sound, but this is the experience of the students that they wear VR glasses and they go into the artworks and they could just like explore the positive and the negative space in these particular artworks to see and explore the abstract art. So we don't have audio, but it's okay. Just like they just go into it and explore them more into the design. So I think that's it. I have too many other examples, but in case that during the Q&A you have some question, I can just be responsive. Thank you, Dr. Patterson. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you. So let me just set this up now.
Sure.
I think you'll have to stop sharing, maybe.
Yeah, I did.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the screen correctly?
Looks good.
Thank you so much. So my talk is titled Experiencing Paintings Through Augmented Multisensory Prototypes. And I know that in the description it said I would focus on the doctoral project. But what I want to do tonight is actually an overview of 6 years of research, including as well my master's degree. So my master's degree, during which I co-created the Pillar project, and my PhD degree, which is almost done, for which I co-designed a multisensory prototype with people with visual impairments. So let's start with the master's in art history. So people who are familiar with the field know that in art history, we don't do stuff. We do like theoretical work, of course, but we don't have like prototyping. This is not very traditional. But I managed to do a practical project in addition to the thesis. And the project was titled the Pellant Project 2016-2018. And really for this step, the focus was on touch. And before I go further, I have to specify that my interest in 3D printing stems back from back because I was a 3D artist before. So I studied in video games, and I was a 3D medical illustrator for years. So that's why I knew these technologies and I was familiar with it. So basically, before even choosing the right artwork, I wanted to find the right idea for a project. And my main concern was to help people. And I didn't know how to do that with art history, of course, at first, but then I started thinking about it, putting a lot of thoughts into the process. And what I decided to do is that, if I'm to help people, I might as well make paintings more accessible to visitors who are visually impaired and blind. And to do so, I went with the idea of a puzzle, a tactile puzzle, or so, and that would paint by number, if we will, and that will allow people to touch the different textures and colors. So I had to pick the right artwork for this one, and we went with a very well-known Quebec artist, Alfred Pellant, and this is the bannière de l'exposition Prisme Dieu. And the choice was also very obvious because there is eyes in the painting, and we wanted to give it a new view for people who couldn't access it through sight necessarily. So this was the idea, that was presented to the ethics committee. So about the 3D scales models, how to decompose the reading in 2 steps. So the first step on the left is the outlines. And then the second step would be to have one texture for one color. And that would allow us to better understand the placement of each of the colors. So this is a close-up. And again, that was not the textures that were selected, and you'll see later. But before choosing the texture, we needed to choose the right materials. And so I worked with a person in Montreal, a firm, it's called Les Arts 3D. And the guy is known for casting 3D printed molds in silicone. So it's very fun to touch, and it's very mushy, if you can say. So we tried to have textures that were only printed with 3D materials, so plastic, and then we have the one that were casted in silicone. And when we did the trials with the participants in the first round, they criticized the textures that were 3D printed. They said that they could feel the lines of the printer and that it was very aggressive to touch. So they eliminated all of the textures that were 3D printed. So we focused on the ones that were silicone made. And, because this was so experiential for selecting the texture, the way I proceeded for this first project was to ask the participants, they had 12 or 13 textures in front of them. And I asked them, which one is black and white and why? Which one is red and why is that? Which one is white? Why is that? Which one would be gray? All of the colors of the painting. And what it turns out that the findings showed that they were having a link between emotions, colors, and memory. So more than half of the participants would pick the same color, the same texture for white. They say this one is flat, it's soft, it reminds me of winter. It reminds me of waiting for the adapted transportation in winter and being stuck. Or this one is rougher, so it's like red, it's like passion. So there was like a hierarchy that was very interested. And they got to test the tactile prototype and make suggestions on how to improve them. So to make the prototypes, what we did, like I said earlier, is that all of the molds were made with 3D printing in plastic, and then it was casted with silicone. And it was unmolded, which is by the way, the most difficult part for people who are familiar with this, because often, if you go too hard, it will break and you have to start over again. So this was in the making. So you have the template at the top and then the result at the bottom. And this is the final result. So of course I have other pictures, but just so you see a close-up of the textures. A few mistakes were made, like this one. You can see the mistake is there on the bottom one because all of the black outlines are at the same level as the other textures. And they should, because of that, it created a lot of confusion tactilely when you try to explore the painting. So we had to chop it back in the lab and to raise the black lines for a few millimeters, and then it was more clear for participants. And things that I've learned from my participants doing this whole project, and it's that art is subjective, and it always has been, and it's supposed to be as such. And so, as a sighted person, I automatically placed the painting in the right position for my participant to test. And he flipped it vertically because to him, it reminded him of a house and how happy he was about, exploring this house. So it's just good to see these experiences, to learn that, it's subjective for everyone, and we don't have any word to say in this. It depends on taste, background, preferences, and this is the beauty of art, I think. We also tried to create the Braille legend with 3D printing at first. That was before I knew you have to have a specific distance between each dot and each word and spaces. And because of that, the participants, when they figured out the words, they were laughing so hard. They thought it was Braille for kids. But then again, people with diabetes who had less sensitivity in their finger thought it was easier to read this type of Braille. But nevertheless, going with the majority of the group, we did a new Braille legends with traditional system. And it ended up being an exhibition at the Montreal Museum of Fine Art. This is not to show my face, but to show the picture on the left, where you can see my right hand hiding the fact that it's missing a black dot. So someone stole it, which we'll discuss later. And then on the other side, you can see the setup. So it was very important for it to be exhibited below the original artwork so that people could touch it and could come with people who are sighted and still share the experience together. Now, the PhD in cultural mediation and the co-development of multisensory prototypes. So I write 2021, 22, but the PhD started earlier than that, started in 2018. Basically, methodology was similar, but a bit different because of COVID mostly. So I had to plan ahead and think about, maybe not being able to meet with the participants. And I can see Carla in the room, and I know she gets the struggle with that and the stress. So yeah, it was basically my initial goal was to have the audio component embedded within the tactile board. But then because of COVID, we had to think differently. So we had to find other solutions. So what if we can't meet in person? We need to make this happen. So the audio needs to come from elsewhere. It needs to come from an iPad, for instance. So there was 2 interviews in person finally that I managed to get with the ethics board, and 2 interviews were online. So it was a good balance. And compared to my previous project, I had 2 participants who were born blind. So I had none in the first project. And this definitely brought a lot of different experience and knowledge on board, and was very interesting as well and relevant. So learning from previous experience, it's very important to have a good glue so that people can't steal it if it's an exhibition, or even when testing. Sometimes people are rough when testing the material. Needs to be durable. We also used wood this time around and new assembly methods. And now, because of COVID, of course, there was a lot of limitations. So it needs to be possible to disinfect it quickly and efficiently. Hence the silicone, was a good option again. I needed to quarantine the prototype when testing. So that means I would have an interview with the one participant testing 2 prototypes, and then I have to isolate them for 72 hours or more before having another interview. So this is adding a lot of time to the process. And like I said, the project was first designed for online interviews, so no embedded audio. So we couldn't explore this avenue for this time. This is the paintings that were selected. So I, of course, did a pre-selection based on the criteria that needs to be considered for this type of project. But then I presented the choices to the participants, 5 choices in total, and they get to pick 2. And the 4 out of 6 voted for these 2 paintings. The first one being by Franklin Carmichael in the Nickel Belt, 1928. And the second one being by Duncan de Gargamo, Outport Icon number 2, 2001-2002. So more recent. And of course, another concern I had was to have artwork that have no author's right, or that author's right are, like waived, and that if not, the artist has gave the right for educative purposes to the gallery. And I chose to work with the Ottawa Art Gallery for this time, just based on their own accessibility approach. And I thought that it was a good place to start in the area of Ottawa-Gatineau. So that's just an insight on the instruction for the 3D printing partner. So how to deconstruct a narrative when there's no clear outline. So in the first case with the Carmichael, I basically drew the outline to separate the perspective and different elements. The numbers are specific sounds that will be added later on, and specific textures as well. And for the De Gargamo painting, the port one, it was more easy because the color makes the line, if you will. So like the docks in yellow are one line, and then the houses are a line, but with no inside line. It's just like an outline of a shape of a house. Sorry, I have a very needy Doberman right now. So that's part of the building process. So this is the outlines that were made in MDF. And this is the production. So I have a small video. The audio is not relevant. It's just to show you. So they're actually casting it in silicone. So that was very quick. And this is the end result. So I say that they're 106.7 centimeter approximately. One is more narrowed. The choice of MDF outline is because there is no splinters. So this is very important in terms of risk, and in terms of, even the feel of the texture, it's nicer. And yeah, so it was one texture per color. Of course, we simplified. So there's no nuance of blue. There's no, different levels of gray, if such. Or what is important is to convey the narrative, and that's what the participant asked for. So the narrative, and then, if possible, the colors of each element. But of course, there was some disagreement when we were doing this, because let's say like the rain texture, some people did not agree. Some people would have liked to have dots. So that's 2% out of 6. But then when we added audio, the sound of rain to it, then all of them love the textures. So it all depends on, the multisensoriality and what output is included. So basically, there was 2 audio components. So the first one was a audio description. So that's less than 3 minutes, followed by an interlude. So a musical interlude to convey the mood of the painting. And then it was followed by instruction on how to use the prototypes. And then, of course, if you were to use the prototypes, well, the way to do the multisensory experience is that I have an iPad, and I will basically mimic the movements of the participant. And I will, like, if they hover over the mountain, I will hover over the mountain. It will make the sound of a forest. And then if it's the rain, it will be the rain. And they also had the option of double tapping, and double tapping will say in 1 or 2 words what you're touching. So it'd be like mountains and valley, or sky and rain. So that's the way we separated it. So I think that's quite a summary. I'd be happy to connect if you want to talk this further. And I also wanted to thank all of my sponsors for this project. And again, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's such a bliss, and I'm glad to see so many familiar names in the room. So I give back the mic to Ryan.
Great, thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Ahlam. I'm going to start by explaining how we're going to do. Oh, I see the Doberman. Everyone, we're going to move into the discussion portion now, and I think we're just at that level of participants where, at least for starters, we'll try to all try to MC how it goes. So basically, if you could use the hand up function on Zoom, or if you prefer not to ask the question directly, but would just like to type it out, you could also type it in the messages, and I will kind of go back and forth. I will call people with their hands up, and if there are message ones, I will also read them out, and we'll see how that goes. And we can always just open up the floor if we're not inundated. So while people think of their questions and want to type them, I'd like to start. That's my prerogative. It seems to me, and correct me if this isn't the interpretation you'd have, that there's kind of a difference between recreation versus translation. So when you're making a 3D model of an Egyptian artifact that was originally 3D, you're making something people can touch, because obviously we can't touch the original, and that's great. That opens it up for everyone, including partially sighted people. Whereas the cave paintings and the paintings it's turning it into another form, right? It's turning it into something that you're engaged in a different way, which just made me think of artist intent. And of course, and I believe Patricia's artists, that they seem like they're probably all dead. Those were older paintings. Some were new, some are still around. Sorry, one was from the 20s.
Yeah, still alive. The Duncan de Gargamo is still alive, but he ceded his rights for educative purposes.
Nice, great, and that's wonderful. That the cave painting people are not here. But it does make me wonder. Like, both the work you're doing is it is of course great in taking what already exists and figuring out how we can translate it for the people to experience it. Is there any interest? I realize I'm asking outside of what you really do, but have you seen any interest? Have you encountered any people? Have you actually experienced artists interested in making this from the design phase? Either, I mean, I suppose there's such thing as people making tactile art to begin with, but like a painter interested in translating the colors to you know, the physical, or interested in being involved in the 3D model phase? Or do you think there's hope for that?
There is a few artists working on that. I can't recall the names, but one at the top of my head is Richard Arlo in BC. He's a blind artist, and he's working a lot with textures. And he's doing, like, let's say if it's a beach, then the beach will have sand in it so that you can really feel the texture. So there's a few artists that either are doing that or are criticizing the ocular centrist ways of the museum. Carmen Papalia is among them. So another blind artist curator. So I think he refers to himself as a visual learner. So, you know, there is hope for that. And it's right now we're at the, you know, I don't know in English, but a cross of roads, if you will. Yeah, so since 2005, it's been a big change in museums.
Great. And Ahlam, have you encountered any currently working artists in your work so far?
Yes. So actually, I've been working. I'm not sure exactly about like the painting. So I've been working with the 3D artists that they are just like making sculptures. So for one of the projects that I've been working, because I didn't present a part of my PhD experience, because I've been just working 2 years with the Winnipeg Art Gallery with Inuit and Métis people. So regarding working with that community, we had some artists that they've been so excited to have a replica out of their sculptures, and they want to put it into the game settings. So I just started based on the collaboration, one-by-one collaboration with that artist to digitize their sculptures. And so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name her, but this is an ongoing project that I'm scanning the gigantic sculpture that she's making for Winnipeg Art Gallery, and we want to put it into the game settings. And based on her participation and the UBC involvement, so we want to create some digital games and also board game out of that digitized sculptures. I'm not sure if I answer your question, but this is like the actual collaboration that we have with the artists. And also we had, I just mentioned repatriation, but I didn't mention, and I didn't just bring some examples. It might be a question for the audience. But we all know that the museum and art galleries, they have some agreements with the artists that when they just like purchase that artwork, so they have the right for that artwork. So we had some families coming to the art gallery, and they really like it to have that specific artworks that they know that it's belong to their family. So this was a proposed projects that I just proposed it to Winnipeg Art Gallery, and we had promising responses from the people in charge that we just started to make replicas out of some of the artworks to at least give the replica to the community and to the family back. So it was a part of the collaboration with the family of the artist.
That's really cool. Thank you both. Professor Dominique Marshall has a question.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks to the both of you. It was marvelous. So one of the things I was wondering is if you could say a little more, both of you, where your own project fits in traditions that you know about. It seems to me that some of the things is completely original. If I was hearing you well, Patricia, for instance, the idea of a color that is more aggressive or less aggressive, you seem to enter some uncharted territory there. But some things you probably are working within traditions that you admire and you try to push. So I'd like you to talk a bit about what inspired you and where you left to do your own stuff in both cases. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominique. So basically, and this is a question like, why are you working on this? Why is your interest in this research? Is there anyone that's blind in your family? No, there's none. I just really have this interest into this critical disability studies. Also was diagnosed myself with neurodivergence in 2019, which also helped explain a lot of things and the relation I created with the participants on some level, on some life experiences. And because of those interests shifting from art history to disability studies in the scope of 6 years, it really changed the way I approach my research. So it's really now the focus is that the participants are the co-creator. They're basically the creator. I'm just a facilitator here. I'm just asking the questions when someone needs to ask them, but they're the one doing the work. And I think that's the approach I'm bringing to the table. Concerning the uncharted territory, yes, I was very interested in the question of the, psychology of how they chose the color, the texture, the relation between the two. Wanted to actually dive further into it for the PhD, but was also reminded by many people that I need to finish my PhD. So I need to keep more narrow. But since then, my interest has really exploded into museum and accessibility on a broader scale, and becoming an advocate myself for some specific things. But yeah, it's very interesting. Sometimes you do research and it brings you somewhere else. So I don't know, Ahlam, if it was the same for you.
Yeah, yeah. I hear you. If you ask me, it just started from the beginning with my Bachelor of Industrial Design. So we have a universal design kind of like specialty in industrial design, because industrial design is a general topic. And when I just became familiar with that specific field of research, so I started to dig into that exciting research. So I started to design some kind of assistive devices. So, and from that part, accessibility became my thing. So I just focus on my master, and also from the PhD. My PhD, one of the case studies that I am working is blind and partially sighted. Generally, I am mostly focused on accessibility for marginalized community, with a focus on elders and special needs, which is blind and partially sighted. So actually, if you ask me, I hate barriers, so I really like to give access to everyone to everything. And working on marginalized community, when I came to Canada, became my things, and I hope and I am focusing on the other projects working on my nationality and the woman in Iran that's currently dealing with some kind of difficulties and the revolution that's happening in Iran. And based on the research, I am just focusing on giving access to the women and the cultural heritage of Iranians. So this is my interest and where my journey started, and I am going to continue it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to watch how much of the people you are aiming to bring in the museum you invite to do the stuff with you. Marvelous to see that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to put a general reminder out to everybody that now is the time to definitely ask a question if you have it. But in the meantime, we have plenty. Okay, one of the wonderful, as both your studies show, but also one of the wonderful and just being in the industry, sometimes terrifying things about accessibility is technological advance. And there's so many more ways to make things accessible, but by the time you get your head around something and make a set of policies for it, it's outdated. There's something new. So let's focusing on the positive side of that. My general question is, how do you see, how do you see the technological advance altering, improving, changing what you're doing? What comes to my mind would be for Ahlam 3D printing. Are we getting better at printing different textures? And with paintings for Patricia, are we getting reactive surfaces? Can we actually just start to have screens that have texture on them themselves, or whatever? Where do you see kind of 10 years in what you do ahead?
I'm gonna answer in a way I don't think you're expecting. Maybe it's not about technology, but I think even though like technology has a lot of advances on these matters, if the mediation in the museum with the staff and the security staff does not follow, then it's just pointless. So telling the staff, for example, that people can touch this, it really matters. It should be done, basic things like that. So I think if this doesn't follow, then it doesn't matter as how well advanced we are with technologies. Like we have still a lot of work to do in museums.
So I'm a big fan of technology, but as Patricia mentioned that, okay, so technology has strengths and weaknesses, and as you mentioned, that's with the developing process of technology. So we have too many difficulties using 3D technologies, mostly 3D printers, as one of the examples, which is a true example Patricia mentioned about. Oh, sorry, I have the accessibility system, so when I just move my hands, there is some kind of like stickers coming, just ignore that. So I was saying, so with the developing process of the technology, I think there is a hope to into these disability research, mostly even in my specific projects. For example, MIT, they're making some kind of like a 3D printers that they embedded memory kind of understandings for the materials. So that is a huge change to the 3D printings industry. And also using 3D technologies like the haptic gloves that you can see that's using the VR system, using this developed technology would be a game changer in this field. So I'm just like following and see that's what's going on in this industry.
Great, thank you both. We've got a question from Ryan Sweet, who's a professor at Swansea University in Wales, saying thank you for the very interesting presentations. Question for both speakers, if I may. Is synesthesia a concept that comes up in your analysis of these inclusive exhibition practices? If so, how do you grapple with it?
Well, in the scope of a PhD with very limited time frame, I think I did address it in the theoretical framework of the thesis, saying that it does exist. But I didn't get a chance to find a participant who was blind and at synesthesia or other experiences like that. And I think even thinking about synesthesia, there's so much work to be done because a lot of my participants told me, and they're completely blind, some from birth, and they said that they dream in colors. They argue that they do dream in colors, but there's no study about that, you know? So we have so much work to do, and there's always going to be research to be done. So maybe for a further project, if so, but we'll see which path I take in the next years.
I think since you totally answered the question, yeah, I cannot add more into it. But yeah, I did mention, as Patricia says, I did mention it in my literature review, which is a very important things even in our remediation process. So multisensory design would even like addressing those kind of like neurodiversity, if I'm not mistaken to call it. But it is a kind of like a starting point. Our projects, even I think that these are a very fundamental research to starting with the for the future of studying that they can just like definitely address synesthesia or some other kind of like neurodiversities that that they are interesting. I did mention, and I just like I'm a sculptor as well, so as a visual artist I made a kind of visual sculpture based on that specific topic, but not quite sure that I just address it in my whole dissertation.
Great, thank you both. We've got a hand up from Natalie Amato.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what are the biggest barriers in actually implementing these technologies in projects in museums and galleries, like other than funding? Because I mean, this would definitely make accessibility in those institutions to people 1,000 times better, whether it's people on the spectrum, blind, deaf, whatever. So yeah, I'm just kind of curious what why it's not happening.
What type of barriers? There's so many. Like human is the first one, basically. I'm thinking about the museum staff, curators sometimes not wanting, this will not look good in the design, or designer for exhibitions. There's so many like practical barriers, like in terms of physical accessibility to the prototypes or stations themselves. If they're not at the right like height or angle, sometimes it can make a whole of a difference. Like I said, again, telling your staff, like security staff, people can touch this. I had a lot of issues with that before, where I would get a participant driving 3 hours with their family to be told that they can't touch this in a museum when it's specifically made for them. So yeah, Ahlam, do you want to complete? There's a lot like more.
Yeah, it's a long list, but like conservation was one of the biggest challenges that I had dealing with the museum and art galleries. So some of the pieces were sensitive and they've been unique. To have access to them, it was just like a big challenge. Ethical approaches was another kind of like barrier, a huge barrier of digitization of the, mostly for my works, not the examples that I chose, but I've been working with the marginalized communities, mostly indigenous, Inuit and the Métis. So accessing those kind of artworks was a huge challenge. And as Patricia mentions, human interaction. So participating, like inviting people with disability, there are a lot of limitation and consideration that we should just consider during the like in-person interaction with the models.
Great, thank you. We've got, I think, a very related question about implementation from Molly in attendance, asking, thank you both for your presentations. I'm curious about how you imagine incorporating this work into the museum workforce. Do you see this work as being added to the curator's role as a separate accessibility consultant, or would you work more with the artists?
Could be all of the three, but for me, I know I'm working as a accessibility expert. So like with museum for a different project, not necessarily tactile painting, but just on a broader scale in terms of different challenges they might encounter.
So yeah, as Patricia mentioned, all of that. So one of my hypothesis was how to design an accessible museum from the beginning. Even that we want to design a museum from accessibility point of view, and even from the big picture, like the buildings, and also just narrow it down to the objects that the museum wants to display and present it. So this is like the utopia that I'm just like proposing to have in future, and I just like model it that this could be a kind of like starting point. These are some examples that could be in the accessible museum design that I just proposed in my dissertation.
It really seems like there's a like I hate to suggest that we have to sell accessibility as somehow profitable another as in another way, given that we often have to. I think, I mean, you both pointed out. Natalie was listening. This is great for blind, partially sighted, but also spectrum, also potentially people with synesthesia and color difference, colorblind, but also just children. When you go to the children's section of the AGO or any museum, it's basically just more stuff to touch. Wouldn't that be great if there was a tactile experience more built into things from the beginning, and in a way that could mainstream appeal. I'm basically saying it's universal accessibility. It's got so many different uses.
Kinesthetic memory.
Sorry, say again.
Kinesthetic memory.
Right. Ugh. Okay, we've got some good. Okay, now we've got some overlap. Okay, I'm going to go with the hands first. We've got a hand up from Daniel.
Yeah, hi there. Sorry, I'll be quick. Yeah. So I have my camera off, but my picture is of a bright yellow sunflower. And so I was just wondering, in in terms of what we were just talking about kind of making museums like accessible, kind of like from the start. I have experience in like mapping routes, like outdoor, in navigation routes, and then also like indoor like navigation routes with like apps like soundscape and that type of stuff. And so I'm just putting this out there that might be kind of like a cool meshing of the two in terms of like making like accessible exhibits like accessible like from like transit stations or from bus stops that might be like well used, like actually having like a like route through like some streets and then like soundscape or like beacons like inside the museums to like get someone like, for example, like from like where they're dropped off to the actual exhibit, right? So if that interests either of you, if you're still working on stuff, then yeah, we can talk, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting mesh. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to call on, and thank you, Daniel. I'm going to call on Kira for the question.
Hello, welcome to my kitchen. I am wondering, so I've read and taught a little bit about how museums are like disciplinary spaces and kind of referencing, like it being better for children, or for more interactive touch, that sort of thing. And it kind of leaves me with this question of, does making the museum an accessible space necessitate almost a whole re-envisioning of the museum space? And is that done, is it the chicken or the egg? So is that done through by just introducing accessibility and it will naturally happen? Or do you need spaces that are committed to creating that change? I'm thinking of the Ottawa Art Gallery tends to be a lot more progressive in their curatorial practices, but what about the National Art Gallery that might be more resistant to change?
And there's even more to your question, because there's also like the architecture of the building. Like the Louvre is not at all accessible for many reasons, but it's a, you know, it's a traditional building. Like they can't have modification being made to it. It's also not forgetting the fact that a few centuries back, museums were for the elite. They were, you know, where you would go to observe things. Back further, it was to touch things and to, you know, experience, because it was really the elite of the elite. So it was less people. And then it was the conservation issues, where people were like, well, then it will damage the artifact, so we need to protect it. And since then, you know, it was like the museum gives the world to see, but gives nothing to touch. And I think we're kind of in the middle of a transition. Don't know where it will lead us, but yeah, it's very interesting to see your reflection on it. I think we're a few in the field who are starting to think about this as well. I can't say like museums can't all change their buildings at the same time. So, you know, we'll probably have like different levels of engagement with accessibility and different audiences. But the thing is that they do recognize that the audience is not the elite anymore, and that it's more varied.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. As always, just you just cover all of it. But like, there is a huge barrier between like the traditional kind of like museum, I would call, or even like the modern museums, that they just accepted those kind of new approaches, which I call it a STEAM approach. So I'm just trying to answer Dr. Marshall's question as well. That's what would be the approaches that we want to make the museum accessible. Is it like special fields? In my point of view, just like personally, I am thinking that all the museum and art galleries could be accessible, even though that they are traditional, or even they just like initiate to make a building. So they should just consider accessibility in their buildings. They should, first of all, accept that point of view that the museum and art galleries are a place that participants should be engaged with the artwork. So this is the very first step that we just like wants to argue with them. And if you ask me, I just thinking that I am working on a STEAM museum and like making a makerspace into the museum building. So therefore, not only staff or artists, but also the participants, they can just benefit it, and they can create their own kind of version of the museum and art galleries. Because the old fashioned art galleries and museums just to displaying the objects, I don't think that it could be just like continue for not even like a year from now. But they all thinking about the new approaches to involve more participants and visitors into their space. And because of that, the VR and AR, it's a new approach within even the traditional museums.
I'm going to signal boost Dominique's question, because I'll pass seamlessly into it and pass it back to Patricia. If you've noticed any different, I mean, obviously you do. I guess you deal with art galleries, but in your experience, have you noticed there's a difference between the different types? Are science museums more into tactile?
No, the answer is no. Like you can have the most well-founded museum, and you can have the one museum like with almost no funding. What does make a difference is the staff, how honest they are about their intention to become accessible and how much it matters to them. I've found that most of the time it's driven by one or two person in the staff, and it really makes a difference. So you could have like at Ingenium, I know who was leading this approach and who he is now, and it will make a difference in terms of the way they think. Sometimes they will hire someone who is an accessibility like expert in their own team. But most of the time, I think it doesn't matter the budget. You know, what matters is we're all humans, and you can just take the time to walk someone through your exhibition if you have no staff. And some people actually do that, and they're more accessible than a big gallery. So it doesn't, for me, the type of museum is not like a label related to accessibility or not. It's more complex than that, I guess.
And I don't suppose for our international viewers, the Accessible Canada Act has stages, but there's one coming up. So in a number of ways, there's a legal requirement to make chunks of life more accessible. Do museums interpret the Accessible Canada Act as access to the building, or do you see much interpretation that actually does apply to the exhibits?
It depends. They have different ways to do it, and there's also different ways that it's being audited. So I couldn't speak that much about it in terms of a policy officer. I'm too young in my role, but I guess in a few months, like, ask me again, and I'll be able to answer that question.
Sorry, was that question for me too?
If you have anything to say to it, absolutely, please.
No, I've been just like distracted by the other question. I was just reading that one.
I'll read it out in a second, so we make sure everyone's got it.
Yeah.
But did you have anything else you wanted to say about accessibility kind of legislation?
No, I think it's all good. So
cool. Okay, so I will read this out for everyone from sorry, I didn't get the name, from Emma Aw. Thank you for your question. Hello, thank you both for these very interesting discussions and amazing projects. Smile. I'm just curious if you could speak to intersectionality in your projects, or the ways that other facets of identity, such as gender and sexual identities, may have affected interaction with these accessibility interventions, or your projects more generally. And in the same vein, I was wondering if you could mind elaborating a bit more about decolonization and digitization. Many thanks for your thoughts. And Ahlam's definitely already touched on that. I'm sure has much more to say.
yeah, I was just thinking about that and the future projects that I'm about to work with it. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to add inclusion and accessibility together for the coming projects that I am willing to do it. So if I could. So in the current PhD research that I did, I didn't consider that, but it was one of the things for the future researchers that I even just proposed it, that they can just consider that. Within the bias of the museum and art galleries to present their objects based on the kind of like point of view that they have in the specific topics that I am working with the marginalized communities, and like mostly women in the context of the Islamic era. So, and with the nudity of the objects that are not shown in that museum. So I would definitely consider that in my future research, I will explore that point of view. And thank you for mentioning that. This is a very important things that I didn't have time, and it wasn't my focus for my dissertation.
It wasn't my focus either. My focus was really visual impairment and blindness. But in my master's thesis conclusion, I said that it was proven that women were more impacted by blindness and visual impairments. And like, as a matter of fact, I actually got more female participants than male participants, even this time around. So this is something I wanted to examine, but time is short, and the proposition I made for a postdoc is mostly centered around neurodiversity. So not a direct focus on intersectionality, although it is implied, but it's really centered around access to museum for people who are neurodiverse. So I guess I can't do all, but I agree also this is a very important question. I know a few fellow classmates are working on this. So I'll let the stage to them for that.
I imagine if this, when this gets more and more mainstream and tactile exhibits get, to the degree this spreads, eventually we're going to have to get to, I'm just thinking of gender. If you want people to encounter Michelangelo's David, clearly a piece of art that everyone should get to experience, we're talking about tactically now dealing with a naked body. That shouldn't be a problem, but that's going to end up, referencing it's for kids, like there's going to be just curatorial questions that are going to come up with different sorts of content that are going to bring intersectionality in, automatically, just because it bloody always does whenever you've got power systems. Okay, we've got a big question here. Forgive me, I need to, for the sake of my eyes, transfer to another file. So there's a slight pause. And this is from Adrian Chan, hi Adrian. When creating a separate accessible representation of a piece, is it actually separate? I think about how a photo of a painting, despite how high the resolution might be, is not the same as experiencing the painting in person. So while accessible representations make a particular piece accessible, it could be potentially experienced anywhere, including outside a museum, similar to how a photo from a museum can be viewed anywhere. Can you comment on accessibility of a piece versus accessibility of a museum? This might include requirements of accessible representations to be actually present in a museum space, or whether you think that that is the case.
I have the answer, but so in my case, basically, I know we talk about representation, but I don't label the prototypes as representations. They're mediation tools, and this is a very important distinction in the sense that they will never replace the original artwork. They're just a different way to access it, or at least to try to access it. And from my research and talking about this with the participants, what matters is that it's in the same room and the same place as the original piece, because there are studies about the aura of the original artwork that is still residing in the room. And because of that, they can also experience with people who are sighted. So I don't know if, this meets the need or requirement of accessible representation, but it does, that's my opinion also with my participants, but we really agreed, all of us, that it has to be in the same place, because otherwise it's unfair. Why would you have to go in the closet, or in a small room to see to access your way of seeing the artwork? So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I definitely do agree with you, Patricia. So I just thinking that, as Patricia mentions, these representations are remediation, and also even for the VR, and then like the digital scannings, the actual, the real scale objects. I think as we add the interpretations into the remediation of the model. So even for the prototypes and the replicas that I presented in the museum, we always just put it that this is not the actual artwork, so you can just touch it. This is something important to keep in mind, that we are not making the same process as the artists do it.
Okay, so there's like 2 questions left. Adrian's second question, also wonder about current practices of accessibility, including descriptive narration of pieces, and how this contrasts to these innovations such as 3D printed representations. It doesn't contrast, it's complementing. So for me, it's like it's adding to, it's not removing anything from, it's adding to. I don't know, if you want to.
Yeah, actually, definitely, you just answered. It's the kind of like complementary approach. Just even I just mentioned the tactile diagram, the audio files, the narratives, all in all, they just came with a package to make it more fully understandable for the visitors.
And for Dominique, when you create these mediation tools, you are doing some creation yourselves. And that also is a question for Ahlam afterwards, but your pieces have their own beauty, please comment. I agree, but the main function of the mediation tool we're creating for my own sake is that this is a tool, this is a way to access information. This is, of course, it can be pretty, but I think the main goal is to give access to information rather than being an artwork, because it's not the same material. So for me, it cannot be a copy. So it's very difficult. But of course, some of the pieces are very beautiful. It's just, for me, I don't see them as artwork.
Yeah, I might have a different point of view, because I think that's the remediation process by its own. It's a kind of artistic point of view, and it has its own kind of like choices. So we just think about the materials, we just think about like even the beauty aspects of the remediated replica. So because of that, I just talk about the ownership of data, the digital data, and also the replicas, which I think says they are totally different things. And also we always just credit like, for example, digitalized by that artist. So I think this is a new kind of conversation, and it's a really good question. That's the ownership of these iteration of the original artwork. So who might have the ownership of the digital data, and who is the artist of the final reproduction, which could be like a VR experience kind of things, or even like a digital game or a storyboard game, or like whatever that the end product could be.
I'm going to kind of turn you on each other, and just kind of, I realize I'm asking, did you do more in your PhD? No, I had enough to bloody do. But out of interest and why you made the choices you did, Patricia, you worked with wood and various degrees of mushy silicon, I believe. Did you consider 3D printing? And Ahlam, as a sculptor yourself, did you consider molding or another medium? Why the mediums you took, and what are the advantages, disadvantages?
Well, for me, like 3D printing, I did use it, but as a way to create the molds. It was not possible to use it, as such with plastic, because the participants just all aided the textures. Feeling the lines of the 3D printing was very distracting when you're trying to differentiate between textures that are very tiny and delicate. And it's also a lot of participants told that the texture of the silicone felt like a massage to the fingers. So it was very nice to explore and nice to test. So that's why, simple as that, participant consultations.
For my end, I just went into the molding process. Actually, I just mentioned in my literature review, but because of the conservation kind of like limitation that I had it working with very fragile artworks, I couldn't just like use that process. So 3D printings and 3D scanning was the choice for that specific artwork that I've been about to use it. And also, I've been mostly focused on tools and techniques. So we just come up with the solutions to create our own filaments for the 3D printers to make it like more smoother. And a part of like, it just became a whole chapter. I didn't expect that became a whole chapter, but like the amount of time that I just spent working on the tools and techniques to actually, as Patricia mentions, to just get rid of those kind of like distractions, it was huge. And I think since I did it, like the result was good enough to use it.
Am I right that at this point we can only 3D print solid? Like you can't get soft 3D printed stuff? We don't have that technology yet?
You can.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Yes, you can. Yeah, we have like different kind of filaments, for example, even like it's commercial use and it's even cheap. So it's PETG, it's the materials for your reference if you want. So it's just like flexible. And we have like, we have the magnet, like as I told you, like the MIT, they are working on to give memory to the filaments to react with the kind of like commands that they get it. It's not commercialized yet, but that soft materials are usable.
Do either of you have any questions for each other?
It's not a kind of like question. It's just like mostly a comment. I really enjoyed the work that you did. And I know that you've been like ahead of me when I started my dissertation. So I've been like introduced to your research and I benefited from. Thank you.
Oh, that's so flattering. What will you do next? Because I'm almost at the end of my journey.
Oh, really? Yes. So I don't know. It's the time. So let's chat more about it. But yeah, this is my last year. So I hope to apply for some funding and just doing my postdoc and the inclusion and accessibility both together.
Great. It's a good call. Sorry, Ryan.
No, that's good. I want to make sure, our whole point was making connections. We should actually
we
allow you to
definitely
do
should
that.
Just talk. Yeah, for sure. We should.
Well, I think our discussion's kind of winding up. So I'd like to thank everyone again for attending, and another round of again visual Zoom applause, everyone. For Ahlam and Patricia, thank you very much for two wonderful talks and a very stimulating discussion at the end.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.